Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to get my day started. Thought I'd do another informative video for you guys this morning. And I want to give a shout out. I appreciate the fact that I've got a subscriber by the name of Jason Blaha, Fake Sip Investigator, who actually listens in to see if I'm faking my sips or not in each video and counts how many real sips versus fake ones I make. That's a lot of diligence right there, brother. I appreciate the support and the hard research that you're doing for everybody. If they can keep count of that. So, on to an important topic. It's something I've brought up before, but it's something that was brought to my attention because someone said, hey, they linked me and said, hey, Kineski again and that other ass clown he trains with, who they use the terms healthy fats as slang term for their gear, apparently. I guess that's their term for their side injections or whatever, because they were talking about using the healthy fats for their arms to make their arms get bigger. So I assume that's what they're talking about, their synthol and side injections and stuff. That's what they mean by healthy fats, like cottonseed oil. But, they made a little video, and they kind of took a pop at me, but then they kind of displayed that they don't really know anything about human physiology also. But the other parts aside, they raised a point talking about squats, and I think both of them had said something like squats don't actually build the quads that effectively, and it's one of the most absurd things I've ever heard. But you know what, guys, that's based upon a long-standing myth in the powerlifting world. So truthfully speaking, powerlifters are actually responsible for that myth getting started and carrying over into the physique world, which is pretty interesting, because normally it's the other way around, right? We usually see bodybuilders coming up with absurd nonsense. And they get away with their absurd nonsense because they just blast enough drugs. You can get away with anything with enough gear as far as muscle growth goes. So normally you see it the other way, but in this case, powerlifters are to blame for this myth that quads are not the primary mover in the squat and that they can't grow massive quads. Because before that, people even in the physique world did tons of squats and found that their legs grew just fine from doing squats. They got phenomenal leg development from squats. Not necessarily the hamstrings and things, but at least the quads. And I want to discuss a little bit of what the data kind of shows on this. But first we need to discuss how this myth came about, because it's a common myth. And I think even you've seen other powerlifters who've come back around. Some world champions and world record holders have started noting in the raw world that that's complete nonsense. And it's because they're finding it is the opposite. That the bigger your quads are, the more you can squat. So they put a lot of focus on that and realizing that their quad development is actually an enormous factor in how much weight they can squat. And again, there's plenty of data out there to support that overall muscle mass in your body is actually the most important factor in how much you can squat relative to your height. That's more important than any other factor going on, particularly muscle mass in your lower body, core, back, things like that. Biggest factor involved. Absolutely biggest factor involved. But it's this idea that the quads aren't that important. And the reason for that is that when you go over to how powerlifting used to be, powerlifting for a long time didn't have a raw division. In other words, we had a point reached for a long time to where all this equipped lifting actually became the only thing that existed. They didn't separate it. These were the shirts and stuff that were allowed. And these, just like you have certain swimsuits and everything that enhance your performance in the Olympics that are allowed. And they started regulating what you could do with this. But eventually it got so extreme because we got from a point to where, okay, people were getting 20, 30 pounds out of a bench shirt or a squat suit, but to where they're now getting hundreds of pounds out of them. In other words, a 400-pound raw bencher might be benching 700 pounds now with the right shirt, and a 500-pound raw squatter is sometimes squatting 800 pounds or more in a squat suit and reps. And those are extreme examples, but that's the situation we got to. And because of that, they started saying things more and more in the powerlifting world, like the pecs aren't that involved in a max bench. The quads aren't that involved in a max squat. And in the equipped world, you notice that in other words, the best squatters didn't necessarily have big quads because they have suits to help them. They have knee wraps to help them. All of that replaces most of the work the quads do, and it requires more stabilization, more posterior chain, more back, more core to squat. So when you get into those situations, the squat starts to become not a quad dominant exercise anymore because you have two different pieces of equipment helping. And even knee wraps alone can de-emphasize the amount of quad strength you need to lift a given weight. All right, that's why we have some guys now who squat up to 80 or 100 pounds more in knee wraps than they do raw. It gets crazy at a certain point. And again, once that starts happening and you have an object to help propel you out of the bottom, you need less quadricep. And you need more back. You need more ability to stabilize that weight, more posterior chain to drive through with it, because the quads just become less and less important. And we'll get to why that is in a second when we look at the data out there. And that's carried over. And you do see guys who are like, well, I do a lot of squatting and my quad development isn't that good. But then you look at their workloads and you look at their depth, and there's kind of one of your big giveaways. But that's when you get over to guys who are doing it, trying to bodybuild with it or build muscle with it. Again, sometimes they don't squat correctly for their goals. And then they start saying, well, these powerlifters are right. But again, this comes from the powerlifting world, from the equipped world. The raw guys have noted more and more and more. You don't see guys with big squats without massive quads once you start taking away the squat suits and the knee wraps. And it's because the quadriceps are the primary mover. In other words, most of the force that you generate on a heavy squat has to come from the quads. Other muscles are involved. Don't get me wrong, your glutes matter. Even your hamstrings matter a little bit. Your back strength matters, because there is a little bit of, when you're hitting a really heavy squat, you probably aren't going to maintain a perfect stability in your back as far as the position goes. And at the very least, you need it to be strong enough to stabilize it so it gets recruited heavily. But most of the weight itself ends up being moved with the quads and then the glutes right behind it on a deep, full range of motion raw squat. All right, quads are the primary mover. So again, we know that size equals strength in the sense of a bigger muscle is capable of producing more force, has more force potential. So therefore, big quads equal to big squat. Well, conversely, squatting heavy weights is going to activate the quads. Kind of works both directions here. So that's what's been noted in the raw powerlifting world. Well, then we get over to the studies, and here's what we start finding. A lot of these guys are over here saying stuff like, well, leg extensions can build the quads just as well as squats. Leg presses can build the quads just as well as squats. Well, you are right. They can. They can, but they're not superior. And that's the point we get to. And we start to ask this question of, why are you trying to build just one muscle in your body? I mean, it's like saying, I want to build just my biceps. Why are you trying to build just your quads? I mean, is there anyone walking around who says, I want to be 150 pounds with quads the size of a 230-pound bodybuilder? I mean, is there anybody actually saying that they want tiny glutes, hamstrings, and no back and massive quads? I mean, is this really anyone's goal out there? I'm not aware of that being a goal. So you start to wonder what people are thinking there. But the fact of the matter is, you start looking at the data, squats build just as big a quads as any of these other exercises when they're performed correctly. Just they have the added benefit of giving you better overall strength and being a better full body exercise. They make other stuff grow besides just your legs. But again, you come back to this idea, people will say, well, your back is your limiting factor in squats. Actually, it really isn't. Not if you've followed a balanced training program. Meaning, if you've built your quads with squats, your back will be just fine. If you've been doing deadlifts and stuff with it, they're just fine also. In fact, we saw a study that Greg Knuckles, I saw a link the other day, showing that it turns out that sometimes advanced powerlifters do not even have stronger lower backs than recreational lifters who just lift recreationally at the gym, average gym goer, which I thought was ridiculous. That almost doesn't make sense, but maybe it does. Maybe the lower back doesn't need to be that strong to hit a 500-pound squat. Maybe it doesn't need to be. Once you've got a belt and everything on. Food for thought. The upper back and stuff does, but it turned out the lower back, she doesn't really need to be that strong. Not a limiting factor. Not even a limiting factor in most advanced level deadlifts. Maybe elite level deadlifts, not at the advanced level. Lower back is very rarely a limiting factor. It might affect injury rates, but not necessarily how strong you are. So what we find is that, yeah, it does build it. And here's where we come into the situation to where we notice the differences. When you start looking at studies, most people who are over here talking about how they're not growing massive quads squatting, you see two things. They're oftentimes either wearing knee wraps or they're not going to depth. What we find is that half squats and quarter squats, and a lot of guys who think they're hitting depth, you watch them, they're half squatters. I see there are bodybuilders on YouTube who are half squatters. Right? There's plenty of them. Plenty of them. they're 8 inches above parallel. Well, what we find is that the closer you get to parallel, the more the lower quad gets activated. That if you're only doing half reps or 2/3 reps, that mostly it is the upper half of the quadriceps that get activated. That the lower quads closer down to the knee don't actually get activated that effectively till you start going deeper. But once you start going deeper, they light up on the EMG. So when you start reaching parallel or deeper, that's when you get the full activation of the quad. And it is the lower quads contribute enormously out of the bottom of a squat. They contribute enormously out of the bottom of a squat. So if you're trying to build your lower quads, a nice deep squat is probably the way to go. In some cases, maybe even a pause squat. You know, an inch or two below parallel might actually be your ideal there, right? So that's actually what we're finding on the data. And of course, we also find that when you use a squat instead of a leg extension, your quad strength is actually tends to be higher for the same amount of muscle you gain, which then means you can produce more workload on any exercise involving the quad. So again, even if you're going to do more than squats as a lower body exercise, it's still going to be your best general strength builder that is going to carry over to your work capacity to anything else that you choose to do. But again, we have plenty of studies that have looked at this, and it's been noted that squats actually do build your quads. If you do the squat correctly to proper depth, it builds your quads per set, per unit of training, just as effectively as these machine movements do for the quads. It just happens to grow other stuff with it, and it makes you stronger overall and more potential athleticism. There's no real downside other than, again, maybe we get into issues of axial loading and everything else. But again, most people are not going to build up enough training volume. They're not going to do enough squatting to where axial loading becomes a problem. Yes, it's a problem for people who are training with enormous training volumes, but the average person, probably not so much so. So again, we need to get back to this idea, this myth that squats can't build maximum quad size, because they very much can. There isn't evidence to suggest otherwise, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they do. And people need to understand this myth is coming out of the equipped powerlifting world and coming out of a world where people aren't squatting all the way down. They're not squatting all the way down. Well, I can tell you the same thing. If you half rep your leg extensions, guess what? All the studies show your quads aren't going to grow as well either. Should just be common sense. Apply the same rules to both. Half reps don't build maximum muscle size, right? This shouldn't be a point of contention. So if you're half repping your squats and then you wonder why your quads aren't getting really big, well, there's your answer. It's not the problem with the squat. It's the fact that you're only half-assing the exercise, literally. All right, guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.